Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure on behalf of Stephen and myself and the whole organising team to be with you today, and we're really looking forward to this. Delighted that you're all here. We're delighted to have sold out this conference, and we're really pleased and looking forward to a really exciting day. Wanted to welcome you all here, and first of all, to begin with just a word from Scripture, from the opening of St. John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all humanity. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Just a reminder that our focus today is very much on Jesus Christ, on his work, his mission, and that our sense of creation care today as faith-based people is really centered on Jesus and God's command to us to look after the creation he's given us. So you've heard a little bit of housekeeping already from us. Just to remind you of a couple of other things. Out to our left are the toilets, need them. Over to the right are the stands. We're delighted that a number of groups, among them Trocra, Christian Aid, Russia, and some other organizations are all here with us with their stands. So do take time in the breaks to browse those stands. Although you've got your mobile phone out for your use with slido.com, please do keep it on silent for the rest of the time. If you're on social media, if you're on Facebook or Instagram or even on TikTok, please use the hashtag and then 4 C's, ICCCC. So why are we here today? I think we're here this morning because we just had yet another report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, really emphasizing how little time we have left before there's serious environmental damage, or even we should say further serious environmental damage and possibly irretrievable environmental damage to the planet. Any further delay, it said, on adaptation and mitigation will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. And so it's up to us as churches to take real practical action to reduce our emissions, to increase our biodiversity, to expand our mission in creation care, and connect communities and bring climate justice to the poor. So we have a packed programme today. So without further ado, we're delighted that we have a word of introduction from Professor Katharine Hayhoe. Katharine Hayhoe was born in Canada. She is now a professor at Texas Tech University and works with the Nature Conservancy in the United States. She's one of the world's leading climate scientists, and she works a lot in the interface between faith and science. She's a leading advocate for Christian climate action, and we really look forward to hearing her. She's a fantastic communicator. Those of us who were fortunate enough to get to hear her in person last year or 2 years ago when she came to do an Irish tour, a few of us in Cork were fortunate enough to get to hear her before, as we all know what happened 2 years ago. Everything shut down just as she was beginning her tour. So we really look forward to being able to hear a brief introduction from Katharine now.
I'm so glad to be with you virtually here today. I was in Ireland when the pandemic came crashing down on all of us. We had our last normal day together. So I feel as if I've left a little piece of myself behind with you. Today, 2 years on, with all of the crises that continue to threaten our world, the continued impacts of the pandemic, how it's pushing millions more into poverty every month, the war on Ukraine, it's hard to focus on yet another crisis, climate change, and the loss of the biodiversity that supports all life on Earth. I find it helps if we think of it this way. We often think of these issues as buckets, and we're pouring everything we have, all of our resources, our time, our support, our effort, into these buckets to help to fix these problems. And then along comes climate change, and we think of it as yet another bucket at the end of the row. And we don't have enough to fill that bucket by the time we've already filled the other buckets we're working on. But climate change is not another bucket. Rather, climate change is the whole in every single other bucket. If we don't fix climate change, we can't fix anything else. Another way to put it is to think of priority lists. People often say, well, we just need to move climate change higher up our priority list. But I would say that climate change doesn't need to be on our priority list at all. What do I mean by that? Why do we care about a changing climate? If it were just a 1 or 2 or even 3 or 4 degree increase in the average temperature of the planet, but there was nothing else that happened, it would be a scientific curiosity. We care about climate change because it quite literally affects every single other thing at the top of our priority list today. Our health, our family, the safety of our homes, the poorest and most vulnerable, the least of these that Jesus told us to care for and love. Whoever we love, whatever we love, wherever we love, it is already being affected by climate change today. And what that means is who we are is already the perfect person to care. We don't have to make people care about something else first before they care about climate change. We just have to show them that who they already are, the values they already have, are exactly what they need to care. And how much more so if they're fellow Christians. From Genesis 1, where God tells us that he gave humans responsibility over every living thing on this planet, through the remainder of the Old Testament, where it talks about God's love and care for the most seemingly insignificant aspects of creation, through the New Testament, where it talks repeatedly about how we are to care for those less fortunate than us, the widows, the orphans, the poor, ending with the book of Revelation, where it says God will destroy those who destroy the earth. It's very clear that if we took the Bible seriously, we would be out at the front of the line demanding climate action. We care about climate change because of who we are, not in spite of it. Jesus told his disciples in John 13:35, "By this all will know that you are my disciples if what? If you have love for one another." We are to be recognized by our love for our sisters and our brothers. Expressing God's love is a core characteristic of who we are. And how can we love if we ignore the impacts that climate change is having on the poorest and most vulnerable right here at home, as well as on the other side of the world? Failure to act on climate is a failure to love. How are we to respond? Again, we see our direction in the Bible. Not with fear, the Apostle Paul tells Timothy. God has not given us a spirit of fear. And all too often, whichever side of the dialogue we hear people coming from, they're speaking out of fear. They're speaking out of fear of the impacts, how unchecked they will affect us all, or they're speaking out of fear of the perceived solutions, that they believe the cure might be worse than the disease. But we're told that we have not been given the spirit of fear, but rather 3 things. We have been given a spirit of power, an old-fashioned word, but one that today we more often use as empowered. We have agency. We are able to act. Fear often paralyzes people, but we are able to act. How? Out of love, considering the needs of others over our own, and my favorite part, with a sound mind so we can make good decisions with the information that God has given us, some of it through science. So, what do we do with this? Something that's very biblical, I would argue. We can use our voice to advocate for change. It turns out that the biggest problem we have is not the people who say, oh, it isn't a big deal. It's the people who are worried but don't know what to do. Most of us are worried, but very few of us know what to do. And that is where our churches and our communities can step up. Talk about why it matters. Talk about how it's affecting us here and now in ways that matter. Talk about how we can change how we eat, how we travel, how we live, how we heat and cool our homes, where we get our energy from, what we do with our food waste. Talk about what these real solutions look like. Talk about how we can invest in nature to put carbon back in our soils and our trees and our grasslands where we want it instead of up in the atmosphere where we don't. Talk about solutions like efficiency that save us money and energy at the same time. Talk about why it matters, and at the same time, we need to talk about what we can do together to fix it. The first step to a better future is having a conversation, not about the science, but about why it matters and what real solutions look like. And you know what? That's exactly what you're doing today. So enjoy your day at the conference, and I hope to see you in person in Ireland sometime soon.
So Catherine, that's a great inspiration, really setting the tone for the day. Come now to our keynote speaker for the day, the Rev Dr. Chris Wright. Chris was born in Belfast. He's a doctorate in Old Testament ethics from Cambridge University. He was ordained in the Church of England. He's a very influential theologian and author, and you can find some of his books on our bookstalls today. He's the International Ministry Director at Langham Partnership International, a consortium of trusts founded by the Reverend John Stott. And he's going to give us a talk this morning on the theology of creation care. And again, I'd encourage you to use the slido.com #creationcare to ask Chris questions as he's talking. So over to Chris now.
Good morning. My name is Chris Wright, and we're thinking today about the issue of Christian involvement in creation care and environmental issues. Now, we could easily try to justify that on pragmatic grounds, that is, by pointing to the urgency of some of the terrible realities that are facing our world today, the accelerating loss of species, the destruction of tropical forests, the pollution and warming of the oceans and the melting of the ice caps, the devastation of natural habitats, which is increasing the likely incidence of zoonotic diseases like the coronavirus, crossing from animals to humans, and of course the ravages of climate chaos on the poorest and the most vulnerable of the Earth's inhabitants. Historically, over the centuries, the Church has made powerful missional responses to urgent human needs and crises in times of pandemic, disease, war, and so on. So there's plenty of precedent and justification for Christians taking seriously into their missional thinking how we should be responding to this contemporary reality that faces the human race of climate change. However, in this lecture, I don't want to address those matters, which are far better tackled by those with the expertise to do so. Rather, I want to take us simply back to the Bible and to strengthen the foundations of a thoroughly biblical theology of creation. As I go along, I'll be wanting to share my screen from time to time, so let's hope that this will work. I think you can see that. So the goodness, the glory, and the goal of creation is our theme, and the first of these is the goodness of creation. Creation is good. That's the unmistakable message of the opening chapter of the Bible, isn't it? 6 times God declares that what he has done is good, and the 7th time, very good. And we can think of this goodness of creation in at least 2 ways, in relation to God and in relation to ourselves. So first of all, creation is good in relation to God, which again is true in a number of ways. First of all, in the sense that the good creation reveals the good God. Let me click on there, bring that up. Yeah, the creation, I hope you can see that. There we go. Creation reveals God through his handiwork. In other ancient Near Eastern cultures of the time of the Bible, creation was the work of multiple deities, all in various degrees of conflict and malevolence, hating and fighting one another. And by sharp contrast, the Old Testament, creation is presented as the work of one single living God, and therefore bears witness to that one God's existence and power. And you can see on the screen some of the examples that I've given of that. There is the fact that the heavens declare the glory of God in Psalm 19. There's the fact that the heavens proclaim the righteousness of God, for he is a God of justice, says Psalm 50, verse 6. There's also the fact that God cares for the land. You care for the land and water it and enrich it abundantly. And there's the provision of God for all the creatures that he has made in Psalm 104. All creatures look to you to give them food. And then Paul in Acts chapter 14 says that creation shows the kindness of God. He has shown you kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons, and provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy, says Paul. And in Romans 1 verse 20, of course, Paul says that creation reveals the power of God. For since the creation, the world's invisible qualities, the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, the creation, so that people are without excuse. So creation then reveals its creator. Now, a second way in which creation reveals God, let me come back to my screen share here and see what we've got. I needed to move on, is that creation is valued by God for itself. Creation has intrinsic value to God and from God. You see that repeated affirmation, God saw that it was good, there in Genesis 1, that's made quite independently of us human beings. In fact, it's made before we even existed on the planet. The fact that creation is good is not our initial response to the beauty or the benefits of creation, although of course it certainly should be once we did arrive. Rather, it is God's own evaluation of his own handiwork. Here is the seal of God's approval on the whole universe in all its functioning. So creation has intrinsic value because it is valued by God, who is the source of all value. So to speak of the goodness of creation, you see, is not first of all to say that it's valuable to us, although of course it is, but to say that it is valued by God and was created, as we might say, fit for purpose, that is, for God's purpose. So, for example, when you read Psalm 104, that great creation psalm, it celebrates not only those aspects of creation which serve human needs, like crops and domestic animals, but also those parts of creation that have no immediate connection with human life, at least as far as the ancient world was concerned. Those great wild places of the earth, the high trees and the mountains of Lebanon, the wild creatures that live there. They are noticed, they are celebrated, they are valued simply by being there and doing what God created them to be and do. So that's the second thing, creation is valued by God. And the third thing is that creation is in God's ownership. It belongs to him. He is the owner of all. The earth is the Lord's, says Psalm 24, verse 1. To the Lord your God belong the heavens, even the highest heavens, the earth, and everything in it. Now, words like that in Psalm 24 or Deuteronomy 10, we sort of get so used to them as Christian readers of the Bible that we easily let the staggering implications of them slip past. Here is a nation in the ancient world that is saying that the whole cosmos, the whole universe, including planet Earth, is, as we might say, God's property. It all belongs to him. So the earth then is first and foremost owned by God, not by us. God is the supreme landlord. We are God's tenants, living by God's permission on what belongs to him. And that sense of it belonging to him, though we live here, generates huge ethical implications, doesn't it? That we can't really go into here, but at least it does remind us that we are accountable to God for how we treat his property. You've probably heard, I hope you've heard, of the Cape Town Commitment, which was the statement of the Third Lausanne Congress on World Evangelization in 2010. And it expresses this accountability like this, I quote, that creation care is the logical outworking of our love for God by caring for what belongs to him. The earth is the property of the God we claim to love and obey. So we care for the earth, most simply, because it belongs to the one whom we call Lord. So that's the third thing. And then fourthly, creation is good in relation to God because it is, in fact, God's temple. Creation is the temple of the Lord. This is something that's being increasingly recognized in biblical and Old Testament scholarship, that throughout the ancient world in general, the ancient world of the Bible, and in Old Testament Israel, temples were envisaged as literally microcosms. That is, that they were small representations on the earth of what was thought to be the shape and the order of the cosmos itself, with heaven and earth and ocean and so on. Meanwhile, the cosmos, the creation, could be envisaged as a macro temple. That is to say that the creation is the dwelling place of the gods, or in Old Testament terms, of course, the one true living God. So from this perspective, you see, God's declaration that his work of creation is good is a way of saying that God saw and approved the whole creation functioning in all its ordered complexity, both as the place for him to install his image, which is what you do in a temple. You put the image of God in the temple, and the place of God's own dwelling. As Isaiah 66 puts it, heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. So the whole creation, heaven and earth, becomes the dwelling place of God. So then, you see, the Bible constantly speaks of the natural world, as we call it, in relation to God. The created order obeys God, reveals God's glory, benefits from God's provision, serves God's purposes, whether in judgment or in salvation, and is filled with God's presence. So creation is good in relation to the good God who created it. And therefore, you see, all our attitudes and actions within creation reflect our response to our Creator God. And that brings me then to the other side of this equation of the goodness of creation, and that is, of course, that creation is also good in relation to us human beings. We've seen, haven't we already, that it is God's earth because he made it, but it's also our earth. Psalm 115 verse 16 puts it like this, that the highest heavens belong to God, but the earth he has given to the children of Adam, the sons of man, human beings, in other words. So the earth rather, is the place of human habitation. It's in God's ownership, but it's our responsibility. The earth, in some sense, is given to human beings in a way that it's never said to be given to the other animals. Now, at one level, of course, we are animals, aren't we, as human beings? We are animals among the animals. We are creatures among the creatures. So in what sense are we different from men? What makes the human species unique? Well, two things are affirmed in the book of Genesis. First, that we were created in the image of God in order to be equipped to exercise dominion within creation. And secondly, that we were placed on the earth, specifically in Genesis 2, of course, in the Garden of Eden, initially to serve and to care for it, to serve and keep it. Genesis 2. So first of all, then, we were created to rule as kings. Let me bring that up. Here we are, created to rule, kings, in the image of God. Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 to 28, where we read, "Then God said, let us make mankind in our own image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, the livestock, all the wild animals, and all the creatures move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. And God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful, increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, and every living creature that moves on the ground." Now, those are familiar verses, and the grammar of them really implies quite clearly that God created human beings with the intention that they should exercise rule over the rest of the animal creation, and that God created us in the image of God in order to equip us for that function of ruling over the rest of creation. So those two things, the image of God and dominion or kingship within creation, they're not identical to each other theologically, but they are very closely related. The first enables the second. We were created in order to exercise the delegated kingship of God within creation. So you see, just as in the ancient world, and indeed in the modern world, emperors and great dictators and tyrants will sometimes set up statues and images of themselves in their countries or their empire to indicate their authority over those realms. So human beings, as the image of God, the Creator, represent the authority of the real king, the king of the universe, God himself. But how does God exercise his kingship within the creation? Well, the Psalms tell us, don't they, that they do it, he does it by caring and providing for all his creatures, Psalm 104, domestic and human, and Psalm 145, which is actually addressed to my God the King, tells us that God exercises his kingship by being gracious, good, faithful, generous, protective, just, and loving, quotes, towards all that he has made. Repeatedly, in Psalm 145. That's how God is king over his creation. And therefore, if human beings are the image of God, then this God of justice and compassion and care, then human rule within creation was never intended to be a license to dominate or abuse and crush or waste or destroy. That's tyranny, modeled on fallen human arrogance, not kingship, modeled on God's own character and behavior. So this leads us then on naturally to the second dimension of distinctive human rule, and that is that not only are we created as kings to rule in the image of God, but also, if I can bring up my second point here, that we were located to serve and to keep, that is, as priests in the service of God. Genesis 2, verse 15, God took the man, the human being that he had created, and put him in the garden. Literally, the two Hebrew verbs are to serve and keep it. So what we see then here in this complementary text between Genesis 1 and 2 is that human rule within creation in Genesis 1 is to be exercised by human servanthood for creation in Genesis 2. And this pattern of servant kingship is very clear, as it is indeed throughout other parts of the Old Testament, where kings are described as shepherds, for example. And then it was modeled, of course, perfectly by Jesus himself, the perfect human being in the image of God, when he quite deliberately demonstrated his status as Lord and Master. Well, how? By washing his disciples' feet. He said, you call me Lord and Master, and you're right. And so I've washed your feet to show you what it means to be Lord and Master. This is kingship exercised through loving care and service. And that was God's intention for humanity in creation, which is then modeled by his own incarnate Son. But as it says on the screen, this language of serving and keeping has another resonance because it is very strongly the language of priesthood. Repeatedly in Leviticus, it is said that the task of the priests and the Levites was to serve God in the tabernacle and later in the temple, and to keep all that God had entrusted to them there. So we have then, as human beings, a priestly role as well as a kingly role within creation. And those two terms, kings and priests, are very significant language in view of the way God later speaks of Israel as his royal priesthood, his kingdom of priests in Exodus chapter 19, verse 6, and how Revelation, of course, will describe the role of redeemed humanity within the new creation in Revelation, where we read that you, God, you have made them, that is, the people who are redeemed from every tribe and nation, you have made them to be a kingdom and priests to serve our God, and they will reign on the earth. That's Revelation chapter 5, verse 10. So you see, this language then of God placing his image within creation has temple overtones as well. For after all, that's where images of gods were placed, in their temples. So here in Genesis then, with the whole cosmos, the universe now functioning in a sense as the macro temple of its creator God, God now places his own image, the living human being, in his temple to dwell there with him. Creation functions as the dwelling place of God, and human beings function as the image of God, ruling and serving creation on his behalf. So let's summarize this first section then to say that the goodness of creation is a way of affirming that it is God's earth, but it's also our earth, and in both senses, it is good. And that brings us then to our second major section, which is the glory of creation. So let's move there, the glory of creation. And this section also falls into two parts, that God's glory is seen through the praise of creation, and God's glory is seen in the fullness of creation. So first of all then, God's glory through the praise of creation. Now, I grew up, as you know, and probably can tell from the accent, I grew up in Northern Ireland, in Belfast, and I grew up in a Presbyterian church there. And I remember when I was a child in the Presbyterian Church, we had to learn the shorter catechism of the Westminster Confession of Faith. And the very first question that we were drilled to answer was the question, what is the chief end of man? You can imagine we had a bit of fun as little boys with the idea of man's chief end. But of course, the word end there means the purpose. What is the purpose of human life? And the answer to that question was, man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. And I believe that the same question and the same answer could be applied to creation as a whole, that creation exists to praise and glorify God and for God's enjoyment of his creation and its enjoyment of him. So you see, this sense that the ultimate purpose of human life, to glorify God and enjoy him, is not something that distinguishes us from all the rest of creation. Rather, it's something that we share in common with the rest of creation. The whole creation is there, including us, to glorify God and enjoy him. Now, of course, we must immediately say that we as human beings glorify God uniquely as human beings, with our rationality, our language, our emotions, our poetry, our music, our art, our work, hearts and hands and minds and voices in the choicest psalmody, as one of the hymns says. So yes, we know what it is for us as human beings to praise and glorify God. But the Bible affirms that all creation already praises God and indeed can be summoned repeatedly to do so. So, for example, Psalm 145, all your works praise you, Lord, and your faithful people extol you. My mouth will speak in praise of the Lord. Let every creature praise his holy name forever and ever. And you look at Psalm like Psalm 148, Psalm 150, where we get praise the Lord, all the earth, you great sea creatures, lightning, hail, snow, clouds, mountains, hills, trees, animals, cattle, small creatures, flying birds, and kings of the earth and all nations, and young men and older, all creation is there called to praise God in Psalm 148. And you know, there are hints also in these Psalms that it's not only that creation praises God, but that God himself takes delight and joy and fun, we might even say, in his creation. There's that great Psalm 104, not only celebrates the existence of the great sea creatures, which are nicknamed Leviathan there in Psalm 104, which could mean whales or dolphins or whatever else they knew existed in the ocean, but it may actually portray God himself playing with them in the ocean. Here's what it says. This is Psalm 104, verses 25, 26. There is the sea, vast and spacious, teeming with creatures beyond number, living things, large and small. There the ships go to and fro. That's human beings. And Leviathan, the whale perhaps, which you formed to frolic there, says Psalm 104, verse 26. Now that last verb could quite legitimately be translated, whom you formed to play with there, as the ESV footnote offers us. You see, the poetic imagination here is that Yahweh God is often pictured in this anthropomorphic language of actions and emotions and doing things, as it were, with his hands and so on. And here the psalmist invites us to imagine God himself joyfully splashing around with whales in the ocean. And why not? I mean, the Psalms can picture the trees singing and the rivers clapping their hands, the whole creation, heavens and earth, rejoicing with songs of jubilant joy, because God is their creator and God is coming to put things right, not only for mankind, but all nature together. And so Psalm 96 says, let all creation rejoice before the Lord, for he comes to judge the earth, judge the world with righteousness and his peoples in faithfulness. And when God judges, it means that God will put things right. And indeed, that is the climax, the eschatological climax of the whole Bible story, isn't it? The climax that quite explicitly includes human beings and non-human beings in the creation, along with every tribe and nation and language and countless hosts of angels. John's vision of the worship of the new creation says this in Revelation 5, verse 13, then I heard every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and on the sea and all that is in them saying, To him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be praise and glory and power forever and ever. We might not be able to grasp or explain or imagine how the non-human creation praises God. You know, you look at the sheep and the cattle and the trees, how are they praising God? Or how does God receive the praise of his non-human creatures? And basically, I have to say, I don't know. But what I think is that creatures praise and glorify God simply by being and doing what they were created for, and that God is pleased and glorified when they do. The non-human creation brings glory to God simply by existing, because it exists only by God's sustaining and renewing power, and thereby bears witness to God's greatness. So, just because we can't understand how creation praises and glorifies God, we should not question or deny what the Bible so often affirms, namely that it does praise and glorify God. The glory of creation is that in some way it embodies and expresses the glory of our living God. And that leads me on then to my second point, that not only is God's glory enhanced by the praise of creation, but also, bringing this up once again, no, that's not what I wanted to share, I don't think. Let me try this again. Here we go, that one. I think that's right, yes. That God's glory is expressed in the fullness of creation. The glory of God is sometimes linked to this fullness, or in Hebrew, literally, the filling of the earth, which means, of course, this rich, abundant, what we now call biodiversity, which Genesis 1 celebrates as creation moves from functionless and empty, without form and void, to being ordered and full. All the great spaces are filled up, the skies, the seas, the land, and so on, with creatures. Here are just some other examples of how that fullness is expressed in the Bible. To the Lord your God belongs the earth and its fullness, says Psalm 24, verse 1. The English often just says, and everything in it, which is a bit lame, I think. In Psalm 50, verse 12, God says, to me belongs the world and its fullness, after describing the animals of the forest, the cattle, the birds, and the insects, and so on. In Psalm 104, verse 31, may the glory of the Lord endure forever. May the Lord rejoice in all his works, in a psalm which has just been celebrating all the creation works of God. So the Psalms then place the glory of God in parallelism with all his works, which is another way, of course, of expressing the fullness of creation and the amazing biodiversity of our planet. So this gives to me, I think, a very interesting perspective on the cry of the seraphim during Isaiah's vision of the temple, of God in the temple in Isaiah chapter 6. Let me just go there for a moment. If you have a Bible, you might want to turn to Isaiah 6, but you remember the familiar verse that the seraphim cry out in the temple, holy, 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 Yahweh Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts, the fullness or filling of all the earth, his glory. That's the literal Hebrew. The filling of all the earth, his glory. Now that's usually translated in English as the whole earth is full of his glory, which of course is true. But reading the sentence in English that way can somewhat marginalize that word full, as if the earth is just a kind of bucket or receptacle that's got filled up with God's glory. But actually that word fullness stands emphatically first in the Hebrew sentence as a noun. And that fullness of the earth, as we've seen, is a shorthand expression for the abundance of life on earth in all its wonderful forms and diversity. So it would be perfectly possible, as some scholars have said and some commentaries point out, to translate those words, the fullness of all the earth, his glory, as meaning the abundance and diversity of life that so fills the whole earth constitutes the glory of God. That's to say, the glory of God is rendered to us, is delivered to us, in a sense, through the abundance of God's own creation. Now, of course, we need to be careful at that point that we're not reading pantheism into such a statement, as if to say that there's nothing more to God than simply the sum of all creation, that just creation is God in some way. because the Psalms also say that God's glory transcends creation. You have set your glory above the heavens is one of the ways that the Psalms express that truth. But having said that God transcends creation, of course, we can still affirm that the glory of God is mediated to us through creation itself, and not only in the awesome majesty of the heavens, as Psalm 19 says, but also through the abundance of life on the earth. In other words, we live in a glory-filled earth, which is one reason why Paul says that people are without excuse when we fail to glorify God and to give thanks to him, as Paul says in Romans chapter 1, verses 20 and 21. Proverbs chapter 14, verse 31 says this, that whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honors God. Now, the principle there is quite clear that since human beings are made in God's image, whatever we do to other people, in some sense, we are doing to God. And you remember that Jesus extended that principle in relation to himself in Matthew 25. And I would argue that it's a perfectly legitimate extension of that same principle to conclude that since the fullness of created life on earth in some sense constitutes the glory of God, or at least one of the ways in which we experience the glory of God, then one could say that whatever fulfills Genesis chapters 1 and 2 by developing and enhancing and using the resources of the earth is a way of glorifying God. We serve it, we care for it, we work within it in all our work as human beings. We acknowledge, we contribute to the glory of God. But at the same time, it seems to me that we could argue then conversely that whatever destroys creation needlessly degrades, pollutes, wastes the life on earth, diminishes God's glory. That's one part of what is at stake, you see, from a biblical Christian point of view, in the attitudes and the positions and the actions that we take in this current ecological crisis and debate. Basically, what this is saying is how we treat God's earth reflects how we treat its creator, and our creator too, of course. Well, that leads me then to the third section. We looked at the goodness of creation and the glory of creation, and so now we move on to the goal of creation. So let's go there. Now, at this point, we're no longer just looking back to the original creation and our role within it, nor are we just, as it were, looking forward to looking around at the glory of God that is expressed in the praise of creation and the fullness of the earth. At this point, we're looking forward to God's ultimate purpose for creation. What is God's plan and goal for creation itself? And this is actually a very encouraging place to look, because the very first thing that the Bible teaches us is that creation is included within God's plan of redemption through the cross and resurrection of Christ. Because you see, actually, the first thing we need to say is that creation needs redemption. From the early chapters of the Bible, from the beginning of the Bible, it's made very clear that human sin and satanic evil have affected the natural order just as much as the human and spiritual life of human beings. Cursed is the earth because of you, said God to Adam and Eve, you remember, in Genesis chapter 3. And I think that the primary focus, by the way, of that statement is on the earth, which incidentally, if you know anything of Hebrew, it's the word Adamah rather than the word Eretz there. And the word Adamah usually refers to the earth in the sense of the soil, the ground, where we human beings live, rather than on what we now in modern thought would describe as the whole planet, the earth as a sphere, as it were. So I think what is being described here is that the curse on the earth refers to human life and work on the earth rather than something affecting the geological structures or functioning of the planet itself. That's to say, and I know there's controversy here and you may disagree with me, but I don't personally believe that we should attribute all the natural phenomena that are potentially destructive, like the shifting of the tectonic plates, or earthquakes and tsunamis and volcanoes and so on, we don't attribute all of those to the curse, because those geological realities are simply part of the way God has made life on earth possible at all. But the fact is that without the shifting of the tectonic plates, there would be no mountains. Without mountains, there'd be no rivers, there'd be no soil, there'd be no climatic variation, no precipitation, and many other features of life on planet Earth that have made it fit for organic life and ultimately human habitation. So no, I don't think that those things are necessarily the result of the curse, but at the same time, we do have to take into account that Paul makes the clear theological affirmation that the whole creation is, in some sense, frustrated, subjected to futility, to decay and bondage, he says in Romans chapter 8, and indeed that it will remain so until it is liberated by God and, as he puts it, brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. And that is the future that God has for his creation, that creation will be brought into the liberated freedom that God also plans for us. So how can I put that better? It's to say the truth then is that just as creation shares in the effects of our sin, so we will share in the fullness of creation's redemption. Creation suffers with us and indeed because of us, but we will rejoice with creation when God liberates it along with us from all suffering and death and decay. Because God's ultimate purpose, says Paul in that amazing text, Ephesians chapter 1, verse 10, Paul says that God's ultimate purpose is to bring unity to all things in heaven and earth under Christ. The whole creation, he says, is to be brought into a reconciled wholeness in Christ. I think that's one of the most astonishingly universal affirmations in the Bible. What it means is, you see then, that we are not going to be saved out of the earth, but saved along with the earth. Now, where did Paul get such an idea from? And the answer to that is clearly from the scriptures. He's simply repeating and amplifying and putting in the light of the redemption of Christ what the Old Testament and the prophets had already said, because the prophets certainly included creation in their understanding of salvation, or as we might say, they included ecology in their eschatology. Let me put it like this as we move on here and bring up the next point. Here are some texts that will express this. Isaiah chapter 11, verses 6 to 9. The Messianic era will include environmental harmony. The wolf will live with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the goat, the calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. There's all that wonderful passage there in Isaiah chapter 11. And they will neither harm nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea, says Isaiah in chapter 11. And then in chapter 65, Isaiah has this incredible picture of the new heavens and the new earth. God says, I am creating. It's actually in a participle form. I am creating new heavens and new earth. And you read the rest of that section, Isaiah 65, verses 17 to 25. It describes life on earth filled with joy, it's life fulfilling, it's family building, there's deep satisfaction, there's fruitfulness, there's work, and it's all free from the curses of frustration and injustice and oppression, and with environmental peace and harmony. So much of Isaiah 65, by the way, is what crops up in Revelation 21 and 22. Or one could think of Psalm 96. I've already read this from verses 10 to 13, where all of creation is pictured as bursting forth in joy because God has come in to put things right. Now, we might be tempted to think, well, this is all just Old Testament stuff. This is because they thought in material terms, they were earthbound. This all gets transcended when we come to the New Testament, which is, of course, much more spiritual. But no, we can't really do that. That kind of Platonic dualism simply won't do either in the Old Testament or indeed in the New, because it is the Apostle Paul who speaks of a liberated new creation, which he says is being brought to birth within the womb of this creation. He says the creation that we now know is groaning but it's groaning with the pains of childbirth. The labor pains of this creation are the birth of the new creation, which is why in that wonderful portrayal in Romans chapter 8, verses 18, we read that we who await the redemption of our bodies will inhabit the new creation in our resurrection bodies, which will be modeled on the prototype, of course, which was the resurrection body of Jesus himself. Because as Paul says in Philippians chapter 3, that God, who by the power that enables him to bring everything under his control, will transform our lowly bodies so that they will be like his glorious body. But that's one reason, by the way, well, not by the way, it's actually very important. It's one reason why the bodily resurrection of Jesus is so vitally important. You see, so many people still have this idea that, well, the resurrection of Jesus is just a kind of a nice story to say that Jesus sort of lives on in our hearts, or that basically the disciples just saw a kind of spiritual hallucination of Jesus. Well, that's what they actually thought they were looking at. Do you remember in Luke 24? They thought the risen Jesus was a ghost, but he deliberately demonstrated to him that he wasn't, that he was fully physical with body parts and hands and feet and a side and flesh and bones, able to be touched, to eat food, to light a fire, to cook breakfast in John chapter 21. So the resurrection then of Jesus of Nazareth, you see, is God's yes to the whole physical created order. The risen Jesus is the first fruits of the new creation, and we shall be like him fully in bodily, human, restored creation. Now, at that point, of course, we do face a question. Some people say, yeah, well, then what is meant by that language of fiery destruction and dissolution that we find in some descriptions of the so-called end of the world? And so we need to see, as our second point here, what I want to bring up now is that this, what the Bible talks about, is not obliteration, but restoration. The redemption of creation will involve purging, not obliteration. You see, some people believe, and may well possibly be some who are listening to me now, I don't know, that the whole idea of this redemption of creation is a bit hard to understand because they believe that the future of the whole universe is cosmic conflagration. It's all just going to be chucked in a kind of cosmic crematorium and burnt to nothing. And sometimes that view may be because of a, as I said earlier, an unbiblical Platonic dualism in which matter itself is seen as somehow inferior and evil and temporary, and only the spiritual realm, so thought of, is pure and eternal. And so they then envisage the future as a way of us escaping from the earth, from all the shackles of being physical, and going to enjoy some spiritual heaven with God, which is sort of what the Greeks taught, but not what the Bible teaches. But even those who aren't infected with that kind of dualism still do want to take seriously what Peter says in that passage that I've got on the screen, 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 10 to 12. And here's what we read, that the day of the Lord will come like a thief, the heavens will disappear with a roar, the elements will be destroyed by fire, and the earth and everything done in it will be laid bare. So surely they want to argue the day of the Lord then that's described here is speaking of fiery final destruction, not redemption and renewal. However, what I would like you to see very clearly and carefully, and especially if you have a Bible and can turn to 2 Peter chapter 3, that would be very helpful, is to see the context of the argument that he's making in the whole chapter. See, in 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter is arguing against those who were scoffing at the idea of some coming future judgment. They were complacently saying, no, everything is just going to go on as it always has done. That's what Peter says in verses 3 and 4. But what they forget, says Peter, is that that's exactly the attitude that was around before the flood. But God did intervene and act in judgment. And so God will assuredly and finally do in the future what he prefigured by doing in the past. Peter says, what he did then by water, he will in the end do by fire. Now, the key thing to observe here is that the language of the destruction of the world is used in both parts of the chapter. In verses 6 and 7, Peter says, by these waters, the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. And by the same word, the present heavens and earth are reserved for fire, being kept for the day of judgment and the destruction of the ungodly. See, if you ask the question, what was destroyed in the flood? The answer is not the whole planet Earth or all of creation, but rather the ungodly human society on the earth at that time, the destruction of the ungodly, as Peter says. So this apocalyptic language and imagery of fire in the second part of the chapter should be understood in the biblical sense of purging, cleansing fire, just as the language of water is being used in the first part of the chapter. The universe will be purged of all evil, and the earth and everything done in it will be laid bare, says Peter. That is, laid bare to the all-seeing eye of our Creator and our Judge. And after that fiery cleansing, after the destruction of the world in that sinful rebellion against God, then Peter continues in verse 13, in keeping with his promise, we are looking forward to a new heaven and a new earth where righteousness dwells. So you see, the future is not one of obliteration, evacuation, and escape, but one of restoration, renewal, and ultimate righteousness. But how will all this be accomplished? Well, in fact, it already has been. We may not be able to imagine with our finite brains what this new creation will be like, or even how God will do it. I mean, there's so many questions that we want to ask, which really we can't answer. But Paul assures us that this new creation is already guaranteed, and not only guaranteed, but already accomplished in anticipation through the cross and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And here I need to direct us to perhaps one of the most wonderful texts in the whole of the New Testament, and that is Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 to 20. We read that the whole of creation has been reconciled to God through the cross and resurrection of Christ. I think these verses must be one of the most breathtaking passages that Paul ever wrote about Jesus Christ. He paints in truly cosmic colors and dimensions. See, 5 times in these verses, 5 times Paul uses a phrase in Greek, ta panta, which means all things. And several times he makes clear what he means by all things. He means all things in heaven and on earth and under the earth. In other words, he couldn't be clearer. It's the whole creation he's talking about. And he tells us that the whole creation was created by Christ and for Christ, is sustained in existence by Christ, and has been reconciled to God by Christ, specifically by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. And that last phrase is so important, isn't it? We need to lift up our eyes and see the truly cosmic scope of the death of Christ. Paul says that through the cross, God has accomplished the reconciliation of creation. And you see, it's in that vast context, a creational context of reconciliation and redemption, that Paul then goes on to say in Colossians 1, verse 21, oh, and you also, he said, you also get to be part of this. Now, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we tend to present the gospel the other way around. We start at the personal level. Christ died to atone for our sins and to grant us eternal life. Wonderfully true. Praise God, I believe that. And then we might go on to the ecclesial level, that all of us who are redeemed by Christ are part of God's church. We're the people of God, the body of Christ. So, you'd better join a church because we're part of that people. And then we might possibly go on to the rest of creation, because obviously we've got to go on living here on the earth until Christ returns. But it's interesting that Paul moves in the exactly opposite direction. He starts with Christ's cosmic creational lordship over all creation, which, by the way, is also where Jesus starts in the Great Commission. All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, he says. Now then, you go and make disciples of the nations. And then Paul moves on to speak about the church, which is the body of Christ, of which he is the head. Then he comes back to the redemption of all creation through the cross. And then finally, he comes to individual believers who have heard this gospel, this good news, and responded in faith. You believers in Colossae, he says, you get to be part of this great cosmic story of redemption, creation, reconciliation. When you came to believe this gospel, he says, this good news in verse 23, the biblical gospel that includes all creation within the redeeming, saving, reconciling plan of God, accomplished, let's never forget, accomplished through the cross and resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. So, what then is our final destination? And it's amazing, isn't it, how many Christians, very regrettably, still believe that the end of the whole story will end with us leaving the earth and going off to heaven to somewhere rather live there instead. And that, of course, is partly due to the influence of so many hymns and songs which unfortunately use exactly that kind of imagery, which talk about us going up or God taking us up, or, when Christ shall come with shouts of acclamation and take me home. Well, he doesn't come to take me anywhere. He comes to make his home here with us. That's the way the Bible ends. So many of our hymns have this escapist eschatology that we leave the earth to go to heaven. It's not the way the Bible ends. Now, don't get me wrong, because of course, there is this very important truth which gives comfort and hope to all believers, and Paul himself teaches it, that when believers in Jesus die in faith and die in Christ, as they fall asleep in Christ, as Paul puts it, then they go to be with him, that they're safe, that they're secure, that they're at rest, and that in that sense, believers who have died are freed from all the perils and suffering of this earthly life and are with Christ in some way that Paul describes in Philippians and elsewhere. But the Bible makes it very clear that that so-called intermediate state, which is the word that theologians have often given to it, is exactly that. It's intermediate. It's not our final destination to stay in heaven. The Bible's great final movement is not us all going up somewhere else, but God coming here, bringing the city of God, re-establishing the unity of heaven and earth as his dwelling place with us forever. Look at Revelation chapter 21, the first five verses. 3 times in a loud voice from the throne of God, we hear that God is now with humanity, with them, with us. And let's remember that the word Emmanuel doesn't mean us with God, it means God with us. The Bible doesn't end as the final destination with us going somewhere else to be with God, but God coming to earth, the renewed, cleansed earth, to be with us. Just as the prophet Isaiah prayed, oh, that you would rend the heavens and come down. And God says, I will. And in that new creation, with God dwelling at last in the cleansed temple of his whole creation. See, that's why John didn't see a little temple in the city of God. There's no need for a temple in the city of God because God was dwelling everywhere. The whole creation has become the dwelling place of God. Then the tribute of the nations will be brought into the city of God. The glory of the kings, purged, purified, contributing to the glory of God, as we read there in Revelation 21, verses 22 to 27. So let me conclude with some words again, just from the Cape Town commitment, because I think this says it rather well. If I can bring it on here. Where are we? Yep, that's where we go. Here it is, and I'll read it to you. It says that the earth is created, sustained, and redeemed by Christ. We cannot claim to love God while abusing what belongs to Christ by right of creation, redemption, and inheritance. We, and that means we as Christians, we care for the earth and responsibly use its abundant resources, not according to the rationale of the secular world, but for the Lord's sake. If Jesus is Lord of all the earth, which of course he is, we cannot separate our relationship to Christ from how we act in relation to the earth. For to proclaim the gospel that says Jesus is Lord, which is the very essence of the gospel, is to proclaim the gospel that includes the earth, since Christ's lordship is over all creation. Creation care is thus a gospel issue within the lordship of Christ. So as we come to conclusion, then what does this all mean for our ecological thinking and action here and now? Well, it means that in the godly use of and care for the creation, we are doing two things at the same time. On the one hand, we are exercising the created role that God gave us from the very beginning. And in so doing, we can properly be glorifying God in all our work within creation and for creation. But secondly, and on the other hand, we are anticipating the role that we will have in the new creation, when we shall then assume our proper role as kings and priests, exercising that loving rule of God over the rest of creation and serving creation on God's behalf as the place of God's temple dwelling. In other words, ecological action now is both a creation responsibility from the Bible's beginning and also an eschatological sign of the Bible's ending, which is also, of course, a new beginning. Christian ecological action points towards and anticipates the restoration of our proper status and function in creation. It means that we are behaving as we were originally created to do, and as we shall one day be fully redeemed for. And the Bible tells us the earth, God's creation, is waiting with eager longing, says Paul, for the revealing of its appointed kings and priests, that is, the redeemed human race, glorifying God in the temple of his renewed creation under the lordship of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you very much, Chris. And I think we have Chris on the Zoom right now. Can you hear us, Chris?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you very much.
That's great.
People have been submitting questions. You've been speaking. And just to let you know how Slido works, you can vote up a question. So we're going to pick the most popular questions for you, Chris. I have them here. So don't worry about, I'll read them out to you. How often do you think this theology should be directly preached?
Well, I saw that question. I mean, at least sometimes. I mean, it seems sometimes, in the churches, it's never preached. Yet if we were being faithful as, especially if we're pastors leading churches and are planning our preaching program, then surely there ought to be included within it somewhere preaching about creation from creation Psalms or from Isaiah or from Genesis or from Colossians, that this should feature somewhere within our preaching program. I'm not saying it has to be every Sunday, but it ought to be in there somewhere, that a church should be hearing that the gospel is not just about sin and personal forgiveness and going to heaven when you die, that the gospel begins with God's purposes for creation and includes us within it. So I think we should be preaching it at least sometimes.
Brilliant. Thank you. The votes are coming in thick and fast here, actually. Next one. Some people use the fact that the earth will be redeemed as an argument to not care for creation. That which is rotten will be purged away. How do you respond to that?
Well, I sometimes I become quite cynical about that kind of view. Sometimes people would say the opposite, that it's because the world is going to be burnt up that we shouldn't bother caring for it now. And it's interesting to hear someone suggesting it because it will be redeemed, that we shouldn't care for it now. We don't take that attitude towards our own bodies, do we? Either way. In other words, because as a Christian, we might want to say, well, we go to a doctor and we're sick, and the doctor says, well, you're going to be burnt up in a crematorium, so why should I care for you now? We get out of that surgery pretty fast. Equally, if the Christian doctor said, well, don't worry about being sick now because you're going to go to heaven when you die, and then you'll be, you'll be a redeemed human being then, so I'm not going to care for you now. No, we don't take that attitude because we believe in the goodness of creation, which includes the goodness of our bodies, and the sacredness of human life. And therefore, from the very beginning of Christian faith, Christians have been committed to medical care, for caring for the sick, because we believe not just in the sanctity of the body now, but also in the resurrection of the body. So whatever we believe about God's ultimate purposes for the earth in the long term eschatologically, we are still mandated by God to be ruling and caring for it as kings and priests now, and it doesn't exonerate us from that present responsibility.
Brilliant. I like that answer about the doctor. Very good indeed. Here's next one. To what extent does or can God intervene to protect the diminishing of his glory? For example, to protect creation?
That is a good question, and it's sort of hard to answer, because I do believe in the sovereignty of God, and I do believe that God acts within history, both in judgment and sometimes redemptively in salvation within history, not in its final sense. But so often God seems to act through human beings, as it were, and it's not that he's absent, but he chooses to say, look, this is what I have called you to do, so don't expect me to suddenly, intervene with something miraculous, when I've given you both the tools and the command and the motivation, and also the warnings about what will happen if you don't act in here. So I don't know whether the Bible gives us grounds to say, well, God will somehow reverse global warming, because God could do that. God sometimes, seems to say, certainly in Romans 1, that when human beings choose to disobey and choose to exchange the glory of God for false images, that in the end, God gives us up and says, well, if that's the way you want it, that's the way it will be. And that's part of my fear, is that, we are into that kind of territory already. But in the end, of course, we do believe that God will intervene, not just to protect, but to totally restore creation. But that is the eschatological vision of what will happen at the end of the story when Christ returns. So what we might expect God to intervene to do now to protect creation, I really think God puts that into our hands as those who are made in his image and given the authority and the responsibility to exercise his kingship within creation.
Thank you. There are more, if you have time to answer a couple more. This is great, isn't it? How do we link teaching on creation care with radical climate action?
By radical climate action, do you mean people who sometimes do what would appear perhaps to be dangerous or violent actions, or nailing themselves to trees or chaining themselves to trees, or setting out with Greenpeace on little boats and things? Perhaps that's what's meant. I'm not entirely sure. I think that is a matter for personal choice and decision. I think violence is wrong. I think unnecessarily disrupting and damaging the lives of other human beings is wrong, if that's what's involved. But I think that sometimes, look at the prophets, sometimes we are, or individuals are, called to take fairly radical action in a way that calls attention, that wakes people up. Jesus goes to the temple and takes a whip and drives out the money changers. That's pretty radical action. So I'm not saying that it's wrong to do such things, but I do think it needs to be a very personal choice and decision in which somebody is prepared also, if necessary, to pay the cost. And I do remember that that's one of the things that that people who do get involved in this thing will say, hey, don't come and join us unless you're prepared, if necessary, to go to prison, to be arrested, to suffer. And I've often thought when they talk like that, that's what Christians ought to be talking about anyway, that we ought to be prepared for the cost of our discipleship if it's a real commitment. So I think that's a personal choice for people, rather than something that is laid on all of us to get involved with.
Super, thank you. Well, one more question. It seems to me that there's lots of Christians who get it and are frustrated by the lack of action in their churches. How do you deal with this frustration?
With great difficulty, and I must say that to some, I share that. Indeed, not to spill any beans, but I sometimes am frustrated even with my own church, which is All Souls Church, Langham Place, and they support the issue of creation care. It's one of the, we support, for example, Arosha, and it's one of the 5 marks of mission that is specifically mentioned in our mission, our World Mission Program and committee and so on. So it's not that the church doesn't have that, but there are still times when I get a bit worried about, disposable coffee cups and whether or not we're really truly doing what we could be doing as a church to be truly into this. So I talk about it a bit. I sometimes raise it at inappropriate places. I think we should be speaking out about it. Russia, of course, with Climate Stewards, does have a program called Eco Church, I think it is. Is that the right word? Where churches can enroll to try to minimize their carbon footprint, to maximize their recycling, to do whatever they can if they've got grounds around them, with any bit of grass they've got, to do something worthwhile for creation. So churches can get involved as churches in this. It's not so easy for city churches, which have nothing but streets around them. But I think, it is frustrating. And perhaps that's where we need to be shouting a bit louder as individual Christians to encourage our pastors, our elderships, our church leaders to take this issue more seriously.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. Let's give Chris a big thank you for today.
Thank you. It's good to be with you. Thank you.
Just to let you know that some of Chris's books are in the bookstall. Thank you to Faith Mission for that, along with some of our other speakers. Ruth Valerio is here, I believe. Do you want to have a quick sort of plug of your books?
Thank you. So do have a look at the bookstore. As Chris said, some of his books are there and I've read them and can absolutely vouch for them, excuse me. And then just to let you know about some of the other books that I've brought as well, which I do need to say have all got nice little reduced stickers on them. So do take advantage of that. One of the books is called Just Living, Faith and Community in an Age of Consumerism. And it's really looking at how can we be followers of Jesus in our highly consumer society. We are trained from birth almost to be consumers, and yet the scriptures exhort us to be formed in the likeness of Christ. How can we follow Jesus well in our consumer society? And then Saying Yes to Life was the Archbishop of Canterbury's Lent book. And this would be brilliant if you're wanting to go away from here and introduce these topics or look at these topics more in your churches. I think it's a great book just to read, but it's also been designed for small group study as well. At the end of each chapter, there's some questions and there's online resources as well. It goes through Genesis 1, looking at what was created on each day and explores that theme through the scriptures and then into the current situation as well, and has got lots of practical things. Then just a couple more. L is for Lifestyle is a really practical book. It goes through the alphabet, takes an issue for each letter. There's 2 or 3 very practical things you can do at the end of each chapter, very short chapters. If you want to go away and just have some practical things to do, then pick up that. And finally, Planet Protectors, 52 Ways to Look After God's World, is just brilliant for primary school aged kids. I co-wrote it with Paul Carenza, who some of you will know. He's a comedian and a BBC script writer, and we worked on it together. I gave him the material and then he applied his comedic magic to it, and it's fully illustrated all the way through. So it will be perfect for the kids in your churches if you want to get them engaged on these things. And as we know, often they're way ahead of us already. So do have a look at those, all reduced over on the bookshop. Thank you.
I've read Saying Yes to Life, would recommend that one. I'd also recommend Chris's book, The Mission of God's People. That's a book that literally changed my life, set me on passionate fire about creation care. Arusha are part of our exhibition outside as well with Bertie Sterling there. So if you want to know more about Arusha. If you want to know about Eco Congregations Ireland, you can speak to Andrew, connect your church with other churches doing this kind of work. And there's other exhibitions there as well. So please go up the corridor on your way out. We're going to go for coffee in a second, so that you can go up that exhibition corridor and then into the left to go in for coffee. So just to say what's happening after coffee, there's 2 workshops. Ruth Valeria will be down along the African kind of corridor and go down that long corridor into the left, and her room is into the right. And then there will be Christian Aid, Bob Kikuyu, coming from Kenya.
Great. Well, good morning. I think it's still morning. Yes, it's still morning. Thank you for being here today. We're really delighted to be part of this wonderful event with its heart to embed creation care as the foundation for action on the climate crisis into churches across Ireland. And I wanted to start with this quote: "Forget making poverty history. Climate change will make poverty permanent." And this was said by one of our partners, Nazmul, in Bangladesh. And it harks back to the Make Poverty History campaign. Climate change will make poverty permanent. And if we go to the next, Christian Aid Ireland holds the vision of a better world, free from poverty and climate change, where everyone has enough to eat and can live without fear of their home and land being destroyed. But right now, millions of the world's poorest people are feeling the worst impacts of climate change, and experts predict that more floods, drought, and extreme weather patterns will come. For those in poverty, this means more hunger, more conflict, more insecurity, and a more uncertain future. If we go to the next. And yet we know that those countries which are most vulnerable to the worst impacts of climate change are also those who have done least to cause it. The historical responsibility for the greenhouse gases that cause climate change are primarily the richest countries. A clear case of global injustice where the poor suffer because of the way that the rich have exploited creation rather than caring for it. Christian Aid Ireland is an international development agency set up and owned and charged by the Protestant churches of Britain and Ireland. And our work is based on our Christian belief that everyone is created in the image of God and therefore deserves to experience a full life. If we want to pursue justice, tackling the climate crisis is crucial. And if we just go on 2 slides, Jonathan. Thank you. Like Professor Hayhoe was saying, it's the essential hole to fix in the bucket for justice. One of the things that Christian Aid is really keen to do is to make sure that the voices of those most affected by the climate crisis, those in the developing world, are heard by those in power. So that policies at the UN or in the UK, in Ireland, are not just developed for the interests of the richest countries and big corporations, but that the experience and concerns of those communities most directly impacted is being heard. And that's why, if we go to the next, oh, sorry, we've lost someone. If we go to the next slide, I'm really pleased to be able to introduce you to Reverend Bob Kikuyu, Christian Aid's Global Theology Advisor, who is based from our Nairobi office in Kenya. He has so much experience of seeing firsthand the impact of the climate crisis amongst communities, not just in Kenya, but throughout Africa. And in this video, he reflects on a recent visit that he made to Cameroon.
I am privileged this week to be in the Republic of Cameroon. Cameroon's forests run over most of the country and flow south into the Democratic Republic of Congo, with the Congo forest being considered one of the lungs of the planet. Today, I was driven for over 5 hours from the commercial capital of Douala in the west of the country to the administrative and political capital of Yaoundé in central Cameroon. The entire trip was through a tropical forest, and it gave me so much joy to be right there in the middle of all that greenery. But there was also a tentativeness to my joy. How long will the forest last? I remember walking through such a forest in Kenya, my country, to visit my wife's grandparents, only to return 5 years later, and the forest was totally gone. Would the same happen to this beautiful part of the world? And my fears were slightly increased when we came across 3 trucks filled with large trunks of indigenous trees. And when I inquired further, the report was that foreign companies are working with corrupt government officials to acquire large tracts of land for commercial farming. The informant said that once they had stripped the land of the trees, the companies were abandoning the land with no further attempt at large-scale farming. And when I asked why there was no protest by citizens and activists, I was told that such attempts had led to the protesters being harassed by officials and in some cases being thrown into jail. A quick look at the map on my flight here to Cameroon had already shown that the Sahara Desert is creeping slowly into the forest itself. The Congo forest and the beautiful Cameroon forest all form part of the lungs of the world, and closer to home, for me, form part of the lungs of Africa. But I'm full of appreciation for the indigenous people who have so far managed to coexist with the forest, benefiting from it while also taking care of it. And they do it in pretty much the same way that their forefathers have done, with a sense of reverence and as an act of worship. These methods may not be recognized by the developed and developing world, but evidence shows it has worked for them. It has worked for us, and I am indebted to them for reserving this part of the world for us and being good custodians, as their ancestors were, of this great treasure. But as mentioned, their greatest threat may very well come from a distance away. It may come from the demands of people from the developed world whose appetite is insatiable for what resources can be found cheaply in a place like Africa. Across the border, the casualty of the scramble for Congolese mineral resources is often seen and depicted in news as a civilian population that has been displaced by the fighting of militias to control the mineral trade. But the forest too is being displaced at an alarming rate. The refugees may one day return, and we pray that they do. But will the forest return? Not when it is being depreciated at thousands of acres per week. The greatest threat for my children, and their children may very well be also near us, from people of our own here on the continent, who are in government and connive with these foreign companies to affect and to harm the environment. Both are without ethics and values, and whose only driver is greed. They only think about how they benefit now, not realizing the harm that their own generations after them will have to suffer. Mahatma Gandhi indeed said, "There is enough for everyone's needs, but not enough for everyone's greed." And it is the reason why the environment may be the prime casualty. It may very well be that indigenous people who have done and are doing everything they could to coexist with the forest may end up displaced. Not just physically, but spiritually and psychologically, because they have a holistic experience and a holistic existence within and with the forest. It may very well be that these people who have done the least to harm the environment will pay the greatest price. I saw those people today as I drove through that forest. And I hope and pray that I will see them again, continuing to thrive and continuing to allow the forest to thrive. I pray that they will be saved from what we call a climate disaster, yet what may be for them total disaster. When I arrived later on in the capital city of Yaoundé, one of my key meetings was with the rector of the Protestant University, the University of Yaoundé. This university was founded and is funded by denominations from 14 countries in Central and West Africa. Congratulations to them. To my delight, the rector invited to the meeting a young professor whose main discipline is eco-theology. What a blessing it was to hear that the university understands that it cannot be business as usual when it comes to climate change, and that they have taken this step to actually begin a department of eco-theology, the first that I have known about in our region of East and Central Africa. This step by the church is one in the right direction, especially because it has taken a long time for this to be considered an area of mission by the church. But it was also interesting to note that the young professor's interest in the environment began as a young man who watched his mother taking care of her farm in an environmentally friendly way. This interest led him eventually to study eco-theology abroad, and against all odds, he returned to Africa with a PhD so that he could contribute to the climate challenge that we are facing on the continent, especially as people from the church and as people of faith. He is now training pastors to care for creation, and in turn, those pastors, having been equipped with the information and with the knowledge, both theological but also practical, are to go back or are going back to their villages and training their communities on the basics of creation care and how to farm in a sustainable way. What a joy it was to hear about that. Our meeting ended with a walk to the demonstration farm where the pastors are able to understand and where they are able to practically engage in the things that they are learning. But unfortunately, we did not get there because the blessing of rain fell upon us as we were on our way to the demonstration farm, and we had to abandon the tour. With men like these, the continent has hope. With pastors equipped like this, there's just the possibility that the care for creation will go on, not just go on, but will be embedded in communities who have taken for granted care for creation and who have not fully understood the challenge of climate change. I'm looking forward to seeing the impact that this is going to have as we integrate our indigenous methods of creation care with the contemporary and contextually suitable methods of farming. Beyond this, it seems to me then that an act of responsibility globally is to curb this desire for more and to strive for a world not driven by the unquenchable thirst for growth. For the unquenchable thirst for more is one of the drivers leading to actions that harm the climate. The demand for more is what fuels the demand for increased resource extraction. Yet we have only one planet with finite resources. There needs to be an increased call for nations, especially developed nations, to be challenged in how they are contributing to this rampant growth, and for individuals to audit their choices that they make, choices that cumulatively shape this narrative and that pushes the demands and that pushes the increased extraction of natural resources. As many have said, we should strive for what is in the ground to remain in the ground, and what is on the ground to remain on the ground. It is to this end that I echo the words of Walter Brueggemann in calling for a prophetic voice and a prophetic action of a particular sort when he says, "Imagination is a danger, and therefore every totalitarian regime is frightened of the artist. It is a vocation of the prophet to keep alive the ministry of imagination, to keep on conjuring and proposing alternative futures to the single one that the king wants to urge as the only thinkable one. There is an alternative to the unquenchable thirst for more. There is an alternative to the demand for increased extraction of resources that affect and that harm the environment. And so the call is also for you, our sisters and brothers in the developed world, that there is hope. There is hope. We have only one planet where if one part suffers, the rest of it suffers. And the poor, mainly women and children in the developing world, are usually the first casualties. We have only one planet where if one chooses the path of righteousness and restoration, the desire to hold back in the demand for more, the effort may well be joined with others in a ripple effect that could reach the distant shores, not with the climate extremes of hurricanes and drought as we saw in Mozambique early this year, but with the possibility of showers of blessing that fall on us or that fell on us on the way to the eco-theology demonstration farm. May those showers of blessing indeed fall upon us, enabled by the grace of God, but also by our desire to protect the environment, and for that environment to be a blessing on us, all of us. Amen.
Thanks to Bob. I love the idea that churches across the world are rising up to care for creation, and that we get to be part of this international mission with creation care at the center. Christian Aid works to help people on the front line of the climate crisis to adapt. In Zimbabwe and Honduras, that looks like helping communities affected by recurrent droughts with new conservation farming techniques that protect the soil and maximize the moisture available for crops. Or in Bangladesh, it looks like helping people cope with rising sea levels and the salination of the soil, equipping people and training people to farm crabs as an alternative to growing rice, giving people an income, a way of earning money. But we're also passionate about equipping the church and individual Christians to pray and to speak out for change and to build a movement of people challenging the injustice of the climate crisis in the tradition of the Old Testament prophets who spoke out against injustice in their day and for God's justice to reign on the earth. We call this our prophetic voice. We follow the example of Jesus, who was unafraid of challenging and confronting difficult issues and standing with the marginalized. And that's why we've been campaigning on climate change across Ireland since 2007, when Reverend Neil Cutcliffe set sail from Bangor, beginning the Cut the Carbon March to London. And last November, we took Christians from Ireland and gathered them both in Dublin and in Belfast and even in Glasgow to be part of the COP Day of Action. As Bob said, it may very well be that these people who have done the least to harm the environment will pay the greatest price. Over the last few years, we've been campaigning for climate finance to help countries to adapt to the impacts of climate change. But we also recognize that some changes are beyond the limits of adaptation and cause irreversible damage, such as the devastation caused by increasingly powerful storms. You can't help someone adapt to their home and their land being destroyed. These losses and damages ought to be compensated for by those who have most responsibility for causing them. And that's why this year we've launched a petition calling on Irish Minister Eamon Ryan and UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson to back the creation of an international loss and damage fund to help pay for the loss and damage caused by the climate crisis. On your way out, you'll receive a petition to that effect. Please sign it and take it back to your church, your family, your friends, your workplaces, and get them filled with signatures. Rally the people around you to offer their voices to speak out for justice as part of this global church. Or perhaps taking climate justice further looks like getting in touch with your local politicians in the run-up to the elections in Northern Ireland on the 5th of May. Tear Fund and Christian Aid have worked together on a climate question, and you can get a copy of a document about that on our stands. Perhaps it looks like inviting your politicians to an event, your climate prayer group, or a service that you're planning about creation care, and inviting them along and saying, we desperately care about this issue, or we care about it a bit. You know, we don't have to be experts, but it's that act of asking and holding people to account. One of the questions on Slido or comments is about how we can make changes in our personal lives, but how do we, but they seem insignificant to these massive corporations and these big governments. Yeah, they sometimes do, but we've got to partner the two together. We've got to partner the fact that we're making these changes, but you're making the bigger changes. You need to be so much more accountable for the climate crisis and action on that. We've got a few minutes for discussion before Stephen rings his little bell. We've got 1 minute. I'd love you to turn to the couple of people around you. The climate crisis is a global problem, but we in churches here can be part of the solution. So our question is this. Nope. What is your next step to influence leaders in Ireland to take climate action urgently. I'd love you to chat very quickly, to comment on Slido to indicate your intentions by the vote, or to use one of the post-it notes that you got on your way in and write something down, a next step that you're going to take, and stick it to one of these placards on your way out. We'd love to chat to you more, find someone in a red hoodie over lunch, and so discuss in your last couple of minutes.
We're delighted this afternoon to start proceedings by having 4 of the leaders from our church denominations with us today. And what we're going to do is going to ask each of them to speak about their priorities, what's next for their church, their denomination, and then there'll be a chance for panel discussion. So again, use the Slido thing to put your questions in, and we'll hopefully have a good discussion for what's next for the denominations here and what they're going to do about the climate crisis. So we look forward to seeing them. So our panel today, Stephen is in the chair. So Stephen, thank you very much. We have Archbishop John McDowell, the Church of Ireland, Primate of All Ireland, Dr. David Bruce, the moderator of the Presbyterian Church Ireland, Dr. Sahr Yambasu, the president of the Methodist Church here, and finally Bishop Martin Hayes, who is the Bishop of Kilmore, the Roman Catholic Bishop of Kilmore, and the Laudato Si coordinating bishop for the Irish Catholic Bishops' Conference. So I invite them all to come and take a seat here with us. I know Dr. Bruce is going to go first.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, after a very light lunch. So what do the churches do next? Fall asleep. The voice of a prophet. 3 brief points that I would like to make from the Presbyterian family, trying not to repeat what we've already heard today. Number 1, we as churches need to continually refine our theology of creation care. And that needs to be rooted in what God has said to us and within the Reformed tradition. There are clear frameworks within our own self-understanding in relation to this, and also an analysis that flows from it of the evident crisis that faces us. Some things that this includes, Chris and others have referenced some of these already. It includes dealing wisely with the Genesis narrative, which calls humankind to fill the earth and subdue it, but also carefully with the biblical narratives about the establishment of borders and possession of the land and ownership of the land, potent questions within the context of Irish history, and therefore also its stewardship. It needs to address the overarching narrative that flows from the Psalms, that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, to establish principles of such stewardship of our tenancy here, as Chris defined it. Such a theology needs to offer a counter narrative to the extremes, which we have all experienced, which either make a god of creation, turning it into the object of our devotional worship, or a degradation of creation, turning it into a simple resource for our own exploitation and selfish gain. Neither of these will do. Needs to understand God's commitment to what we already have, and to consider the eschatological significance of a new earth to us. Some who argue that human history is divided into a series of self-contained dispensations of time within which God's dealings with us change. Some folks like that may say that the earth in its fallen brokenness is simply a wreck from which people must be plucked as a brand from the burning, and that the mission of the church consequently is limited to that. And indeed, there is a call within that theological framework to disengage from the world, to be separate from the world, to come out from it, to look upon it as a construct of suspicion, and indeed, ultimately, perhaps to be careless of its welfare. Others, perhaps more persuasively and from within the Reformed tradition, certainly will say that the world is the property of Christ, and that the mission of the church is to fully engage in its traumas, to reclaim it for him, and to be agents of its renewal. So churches need to continually refine their theology of creation care. More briefly, secondly, churches need to listen well to stakeholders in the agri-food industry. I've spent some useful time recently over the last number of months talking face-to-face with representatives of the Ulster Farmers Union, with the Young Farmers Clubs, talking about this balance between creation care and the sustainable management of the land to run a business, which is what farmers do. And our conversations, as you can probably imagine, have included the use of artificial nitrogen-based fertilizers to boost yields on the land, thus increasing their profitability, while obviously pointing out the long-term damage to the soil, which this practice contributes to. In this respect, I want to highlight a very useful piece of writing by somebody who's here today with us, Ethel White. Ethel has written a short article on soil degradation, recently published online by Contemporary Christianity, and I found that to be very helpful, as indeed a conversation with her. Ethel points out what must be clear to everyone, that most of what we eat can be traced back to the soil, and that intensive techniques of management, and in Northern Ireland this is especially true, where the amount of land that we have means that we intensively manage the land in ways that aren't necessarily even the case on other parts of these islands, that intensive techniques of management of the soil gradually exhaust it. And in my listening to stakeholders, I've made those points and others to farmers involved in beef and in dairy, in poultry production, and in addition also with coffee roasters who buy their coffee beans from growers in Central America. It's been a fascinating conversation. Now, of course, the story in the agri-food industry is mixed, where bad or irresponsible land management activities have become the norm. Such things need to be the focus of campaigns, and the church, I believe, needs to be at the forefront of that to change the mindset, including among those who legislate on our behalf. We shouldn't be slow or ashamed to make our voices heard. The recent climate change bill passed in the Northern Ireland Assembly does not achieve an absolutist goal, but does indicate that both lobbyists and those in the industry recognize the need for change. But I've also encountered many fine examples of farmers and producers who are not enemies of creation care and have shown by their Christian commitment, their commitment to it. On fossil fuels, I've been encouraged that not just PCI, but other churches too have taken recent steps to divest from fossil fuel holdings, which illustrates that small steps matter and they accumulate to bring about change. Creation care is important. The writer of the Hebrews prays that we will be equipped to do God's will in the world by the God of peace who brought back from the dead our Lord Jesus Christ. This Easter ultimacy of our call to declare his goodness and grace to forgive ought to be the frame which presents the church's deep-seated concern for creation care.
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here. I'm trying to sum up a document, Laudato Si, in a few moments. And we'll just quickly maybe go through the slides. I won't speak to the slides, to the first 6 of them, and we'll just throw up the quotations and just, there may be something there that will strike a chord with you. Maybe just on that point there, the top paragraph there, it indicates what we're about here today. Different religions in dialogue with each other. And then I'd just like to speak maybe to the remainder of the slides. Since then, the Catholic Church has attempted to respond to Laudato Si. Well, even before, just after that, was the Cry of the Earth resource by Trocra. We'll move it along, Jonathan. Thanks very much. The archbishops, Catholic bishops, would have completed an in-service and then divested from their investments. At the World Meeting of Families event in August 2018, Trocra, our developing world agency, would have indicated and stated quite strongly that climate change is real, it's a concern for all Catholics, and Trocra are committed to combating the effects. Jane is here, and there's a stand here, and there are amongst our congregation here a number of Laudato Si animators. Moving on. Oh yes, we have Season of Creation. That's one of the innovations, I suppose, that has happened every year since 2018, the month of September into the 4th of October, Feast of St. Francis. We would have had a seminar here in Drummondtown before my time, organised by Nicosa and the Council for Justice and Peace. Had some regional days, but of course COVID came in the way of that. It brought together like-minded people from a number of different dioceses. The number of groups that are involved in the Catholic Church with regard to implementing Laudato Si are the Laudato Si Working Group of the Council of Catechetics, and then the Council for Justice and Peace. I work as coordinator between the two. And I suppose the one thing, the news I wanted to bring was that there is what's called a Laudato Si Action Platform, which is at the behest of the dicastery for promoting integral human development. And moving on, it has it's 7 goals over 7 years, responding to, number 1, responding to the cry of the earth, the climate crisis, biodiversity, ecological sustainability. For example, plant trees, go wild. Second goal, respond to the cry of the poor, to address eco-justice, defend human life, all life. And one example of that will be address causes of social inequality. Ecological economics, basically highlighting the relationship, the correct relationship should be there between the economy and ecology, rather than economy driving ecology, that ecology be. And then the next one then, adoption of sustainable lifestyles. Enough is enough, that's my summary of it. Reduce, an example of it, we reduce food waste and compost. Ecological education, it has to be interdisciplinary in view of the fact that environment impinges upon several aspects of our life and reflects the interconnectedness of all of life. Ecological spirituality, there is a conversion required. We are in intimate connection between God and all beings, as was highlighted in our earlier lecture this morning. Promote a Season of Creation is one way of doing that. Community resilience and empowerment are walking together as communities. And I think that's the point that's been made again and again today, is that we work from within our faith communities, and we need to strengthen our connections between church and other groups in society. And so the whole idea of the platform then is using those 7 goals to engage with 7 sectors of society. And they are summarized as follows in the next slide. Parish or diocese, educational institutions, organizations, groups, families, religious congregations, healthcare facilities, and businesses, including farming. So the whole idea of it then is that any group, and usually a community group, would enroll with the platform, indicate their own vision for care of the earth, submit it, avail of the resources that are there on the platform, share their own resources, complete self-assessments on occasion so as to measure how they're doing in accordance with the goals. Okay. And just, I suppose, just something that happened quite recently, we met with some different groups, Mishakara, Eco Congregation Ireland, Amory, that's the congregation, the different religious congregations in Ireland. The IEC stands for Irish Pacific Conference of Finance, the Communications Direction, our group, the St. Louis Religious Congregation, Laudato Si Working Group, Trocra, and then the Council for Justice and Peace. So we're trying to pull them together and see how can we put this platform into action. The project is a challenge. It's not a quick fix. It will need discernment, and it needs processing by a group of people together so as to become aware of what exactly is involved. And the self-assessment provides a baseline all the time. And so at the end of our meeting there recently, we agreed that we'd ask the different groups to enroll at the platform, as I say, get under the bonnet, get to see what's on the platform, what the resources are there, and then meet again to investigate ways of moving forward as a steering group. And one of the possibilities was to organize an event like this. There would have been events organized prior to this, as I mentioned earlier, and that we would do that again. And I know myself and being involved in groups and in talking to people about Laudato Si, is that when you bring together like-minded groups, it gives encouragement. It gives an impetus to move forward. Okay, thanks very much.
I just want to begin with brief information about our mission statement as Methodist people on the island of Ireland. And it's as simple and straightforward as this, if you would think it is: living wholeheartedly as followers of Jesus for the transformation of the world. For us, for our mission, for the way we live out our faith, for the actions we take to care for our neighbors and for God's created world. So our conference, against that background, has directed our people to consider what actions they are taking to reduce their carbon footprint and to protect the environment. And churches are encouraged to adopt schemes which reduce fossil fuel dependence. And the trustees of our church have disinvested from the fossil fuel industry. So, having said that, I want to agree with what Dr. Bruce has said, and Bishop has also said. I think a lot of the churches, in fact, all of us probably have our hearts and minds in one place. So I don't want to go through all of that and rehearse the whole thing, but I have something here that I want to encourage perhaps all of us to think about seriously as church together, because what we have been asked to do today is to think as churches, or to share as churches what our next steps are. There is quite a lot of talk about climate, green energy, etc. A lot of it, if I listen carefully here today, we are concerned about what we do in our backyards, in the backyards of our churches, etc. But I want to throw this out as a challenge to us as church, if we could gather around doing something for the voiceless of our world. A lot of the activities that we engage with here that are creating these problems about climate impact actually a lot more on people in the developing world. Today, when I hear about climate crises and how to deal with climate crises, we are all talking very much in terms, for example, of electric cars, of wind turbines. And I wonder how many of us actually make the connection between sitting in an electric car to Dublin, if you can afford it, and wind turbines. How many of us make the connection as to where the raw materials for those cars come from, for our wind turbines come from? Because if we do make the connection, we'll soon realize that a lot of those raw resources are coming from the developing world, where most of the people, the indigenous people, either don't have a voice, or whatever voice they have is silenced by their governments, often a lot of them corrupt, but also by big mining companies. So here is a challenge I want to throw out to us as church together. Many, many, many years ago, churches came together and fought slavery. In the more recent past, churches got together and they helped in making sure that products from the developing world are sold on our supermarket shelves in terms of fair trade. Now we are talking about climate crisis and green energy. And mining companies are at the heart of whatever it is that we are going to have. So here is my challenge to you folks. Is there a chance that the churches can gather around this thing again, this problem, thinking about people in the developing world, where all the mines or most of the mines for these raw materials are, and the degradation to environments, the injustices of unequal pay, child labor in those mines, and what can we do as churches together to work with our governments so that we can have basic requirements for all mines, for all those who work in mines, and for all mining companies. I'll give you just one example to finish with. What if we decided to pay £100 or €100 extra to for every electric car that we buy? And that €100 or £100 go towards reclaiming land where mines have been dug and have been left open, where arable land has been destroyed, etc. I want us to think about this seriously, because we can have our theologies right, we can have our biblical interpretations right, but we need to have our practice right as well, in terms of how we relate to our neighbors in the world, the voiceless or the silenced. Thank you.
I had prepared a few notes, a few things before I came here today, and I'm very, in a way, gratified to see that most of what I was going to say has already been said, which meant I was second guessing, which is a good thing in the sense that one of the things which church leaders, and to some degree churches, but church leaders need to do is to admit that we have been very late to the party, that it hasn't been that creation care and climate change haven't been very high up our priority list. We've done the things which were quite, in one sense, technically difficult to do, like divestment, and the Church of Ireland, like the other churches, has divested from investments in fossil fuels. Now, it's nearly impossible to do that completely, in the sense that you're still going to invest in banks who will invest in people who, you know, it's a very interdependent world. It's a very difficult thing to do absolutely and completely. But I think Sahr's last point is something that, from an Anglican position point of view, is something that we can do with reasonable facility. Before I say that, I want to just say something about the way in which churches go about this task. It's government's jobs to legislate and to coerce, frankly, because that's what legislation is, a piece of coercion. It's the church's job to persuade. It's the church's job to make it look attractive. And that is absolutely in keeping with the gospel. There was no limit to the respect that Jesus had for a free response from people. It was never a coercive response. And as you know, the only times he ever really got angry was when people misrepresented the nature of his Father as an overbearing person, as an insister. And I think that is because what we're trying to do here, and I know it's a cliche, is we're trying to change a culture. We're not tinkering about with a few rules. We're not coming up with a strategy, because as you know, it's a very famous thing said in business, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So that's a much longer term thing. It's to do with, in our own local context here, it's to do with the fact there are 25,000 small farmers in Northern Ireland, a huge number, most of whom are part-time, most of whom are doing it because it's bred in the bone, they love it. They couldn't conceive of getting up in the morning and not going to look at a field where an animal was to make sure it's all right. But as I had a very interesting conversation with Ethel over lunch, they are often portrayed as the bad boys when they're not. They're the people who are caught in the middle. And we have a job to do, because certainly in most of the, and I suspect it's true for the Catholic Church as well, but certainly for the Protestant churches, the backbone of our traditions are rural parishes, which could with lots of farmers in them. So there's lots of opportunity as well to do the persuading. And I know that there are some people here from Wilson's Hospital, from the parish of Mullingar, who have been doing that, and hopefully we'll hear from them a little bit later. Two final points. The churches are very well placed, certainly in these islands, or certainly on this island, to be the custodians of the long-term questions, the big long-term, the intergenerational questions, which the electoral cycle and politicians in the electoral cycle can't face up to. And we have an advocacy position, and to be a bit of a nuisance to keep bringing them back, because we don't depend on votes. It's as simple as that. Now you have to pick your moments. You can't just be bugging people all the time, but nevertheless, there is a real and significant role which we can play there. And just to go back to the Anglican Communion, last week I was in Lambeth for a meeting of the Anglican Primates. So I was sitting beside the Archbishop of Mozambique, sitting beside Thabo. He was on Zoom, the Archbishop of Cape Town, who was listening in a little bit earlier, sitting beside the Primate of Congo, DR Congo. And certainly for Anglicans, where our worldwide communion is not a communion based on canon law, it's not a juridical union, it's based on the bonds of affection between the various provinces of that. So we have a genuine opening to make those friendships real. And I'll finish here now. One of the big things we need is for someone to help us to work out how we can make those connections without flying all over the world, which is what we used to do. We would go to somewhere in Africa and build a wall with a team of volunteers, and we'd go home, and then the wall would fall down, and they would have to build it again. Rather than, there needs to be another way, much more thought given to how we can do that.
God, we were going to have the Q&A now, but actually we've got two other people who are going to speak to us. I hope the church leaders are delighted to have here. Won't mind me saying that they do rather represent one gender, and they do rather represent a certain age bracket. Hope you don't mind me saying that. But so to try and redress the balance, we're delighted that two of the young people here from the Diocese of Meath, Tori Trew and Isabella Kelly-Roden, are going to say a few words to us now.
Thank you very much. My name is Tori. Hi, my name's Isabella, and we are two members from the initiative Lighten Our Darkness. And this initiative, Lighten Our Darkness, is led by youth leaders in Mullingar, and we made it in response to climate change. It's a faith-based initiative, and it focuses on encouraging Christians to help prevent the damage caused to God's creation. And through the church, we want to make a change and encourage people to make a change. This initiative is distinctive because it's led by youth leaders, and people in our parish take the lead from us. We launched our project in March 2020, which obviously then came COVID. So it was difficult for us to get the project off its feet at the beginning. Even though we were separated during COVID, we stayed together and kept discussing the project and seeing how we could build it into a greater movement. So key aspects of the project that we have been beginning to build since we've been able to meet again is a dramatic presentation where we discuss issues surrounding climate change and how Christians can make differences in their daily lives to address the issues surrounding climate change. In this dramatic presentation, we use teachings from the Bible to express ways on how we can tackle these issues. And this Sunday, we are doing this presentation for the Bishop of Meath and Kildare, and we are also for doing many government ministers and other dignitaries are also coming to listen to us talk. Another aspect of our project is the biodiversity project, which is called God's Gardens of Hope. And it involves 12 churchyards, and it's under the direction of scientists from Cork. And what it is creating an oasis in the midst of farmland. And the project is warmly welcomed by select vestries and farmers. We are undergoing projects so that we can make graveyards and other areas surrounding churches that have been falling into ruin. There's 11 churchyards in the parish that we're hoping to work on. We've already started and we're hoping to build areas for biodiversity to thrive and inhabit. Moving forward, we hope to build the numbers of Christians supporting the project and also taking actions in their parishes to do the same. We are beginning to build bridges with local businesses in Mullingar and work with them on their ideas for climate action. For example, we want to discuss the issue of waste disposal and see how we as a parish can help discuss this issue. Due to COVID, our initiative was brought to a halt, but we're starting it up again now and continuing to build on this initiative. And we want to change the habits of people in our community and encourage them to do better for the environment. Thank you. Thank
That's hope. Right there. Those girls wrote that in the corridor about 15 minutes ago. We're going to go to quick questions. We're actually at coffee time, but if you can give us another 5 or 10 minutes, you can throw the tea and coffee down you very quickly in a few minutes. Dr. Bruce had to go, I'm afraid. We didn't scare him off. He did tell us beforehand he had to leave. But just a couple of questions to the panel, if we may. Again, if you're on Slido and you want to kind of throw a question in, or if you want to vote for a question that's already there, give it a thumbs up. Please go to slido.com and use the hashtag creationcare to access that. But the first couple of questions are already in. And maybe just decide one panelist maybe answer each question, and you can sort of draw it the short straw, whoever wants to answer these. Do you see the Christian voice on the climate crisis as separate or joining with the wider climate movement? Maybe, actually, Dr. Yambasu, you talked about that broader picture. Maybe you could answer that. There's a microphone.
I think if we begin from where we began this morning in answering that question, God created all human beings in his image. In that sense, church and people who go to church are no different. And when we are dealing with questions about humanity, we are dealing with questions or crises that affect all human beings. So I think the church will be very unwise to think that they can go it all alone by themselves on their own. I think we need to find people and voices and energies and resources in all sorts of places where human beings are and connect to that, trying to fulfill our mission in creation care. That's how I would respond to that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll move on to another question. Should churches set targets for emission reductions, say by 2030?
This is a little bit tied up with what I'd said earlier about persuasion and coercion. I think, for instance, what those young people from Mullingar are doing is going around churches and as it were, enthusing them and converting them to the whole idea. And when you do that, then either you don't have to set targets, or if you do make strong suggestions about what people might do, then they're picked up. I mean, as we know all too well, the General Synod of the Church of Ireland passes resolutions all the time, and nobody pays a blind bit of attention to them. The only things people pay attention to are the legislative changes, and I don't think we want to make legislative changes in terms of our canons and how we do these things. So I think it's much better to encourage and to say that there are things you can do, and that these targets are very achievable with these, whatever the steps might be.
Thank you. This is a question to you, Bishop Martin. Are Laudato Si animators available to speak in other Christian churches? What's an animator, by the way, first of all?
I mentioned earlier that Trocra, our developing world agency, through the auspices of Jane Mellett, who is here with us, they have trained a number of animators, and they're active, and some of them are here amongst us, and they are available, yes, of course, and we are already working in conjunction with Equal Congregation Ireland, so that possibility is there. Can I just maybe refer back to some of the previous questions? Yeah. I was at COP26, and I found it was a whole education for me. And just with regard to the question that was asked there about what can the churches do, what can other agencies do? I was quite frustrated at COP26 to see the slow, granted, people are involved, but it's very slow and it's very pedantic. And one of the inspirational gatherings for me was an event outside of COP26, and it was an interfaith gathering, not just of Christian, but of Sikh, of Hindu, of Jewish. And it was enlightening. And it, I suppose, amplifies John's point earlier that we can be effective persuaders. You know, so I won't take any more time. Okay, thanks.
Do you want another question, or shall we break for coffee? Coffee, I think we'll go for coffee. Well, thank you so much to our panelists. It's so good, and especially the two young people who spoke. That was extremely moving and very informative. Thank you so much. After coffee, there's another 2 workshops. We'll do the same as we did before. So the first group go to the other room, and that's going to be with Justin Kilcullen from Trocra, and the other group stay here, and you'll have a remote presentation from an ordinand called Hannah Malcolm. Hannah Malcolm is a Church of England ordinand. She's doing her doctorate in Durham University at the minute. I think it's entitled On Climate Grief. Is that correct, Hannah?
Yeah.
And she's also an author, a thinker, an influencer within the Church of England. She's on Radio 4, BBC Radio 4, Thought for the Day occasionally. And you can look up some of the things on the archive there if you want to see or if you want to hear what she said. So Hannah is going to speak to us about connecting with the disenfranchised and using creation care and climate justice as a way to help with that. Also, Rosalind Skillen, Rosalind, you stand up just 1 second, is here. Rosalind is turn around, let people see you, and look at the camera there as well. Rosalind is a climate activist, really, in Northern Ireland. She writes for the Belfast Telegraph on environmental issues, and I really would highly recommend looking up Belfast Telegraph archive and reading some of the things she has written, especially coming up to the election. Turn around so we can see, not the back of your head, there you go. And so Rosalind's going to share a little bit as well, but Hannah's going to lead us remotely on Zoom with this workshop. So over to you, Hannah.
Thank you. It's really good to be with you all. Is it possible to share my screen? I have participant screen sharing disabled, so if it's possible to have that permission, that would be great. Wonderful, thank you. This is the first challenge, and after this, everything will go smoothly. So hopefully you can all see my screen now. I'm gonna go ahead as though you can and let me know if you can't. Yeah, it's really good to be with you all. And we're going to talk about climate change and young people in the church in this workshop. And it's quite a strange time, I think, to be talking about climate change and young people. On the one hand, climate change might be the crisis which has most prompted governments and institutions and activists to platform the voice of young people. And the climate movement has in many ways been a youth-led movement. And on the other hand, young people around the world remain among those most vulnerable to the effects of climate change, and they carry the heavy burden of knowing that their future will be less stable and more heavily shaped by threat than the world that they were born in. And for those young people in the climate movement, they often feel expected to carry a much heavier burden than is fair to their age, particularly given that young people are much more vulnerable to developing a mental illness. So as we reflect on the church's response to climate change and the role of young people in that response, I want to begin with a couple of studies that offer some context, and then I want to invite you all to think about 3 questions. How do young people know the church loves them? How can the church be a more holy people? And how can we offer our young people hope? So we'll come back to those questions in a few moments, but first, a couple of studies to, I guess, situate the conversation that we're having today. And the first study I want to point you to is a global survey of over 10,000 young people from around the world, which was published last autumn. And it was led by Bath University and conducted across 10 countries with young people aged 16 to 25. And the survey found that 3/4 of young people thought that the future was frightening, with more than half saying they thought humanity was doomed. 60% were either very worried or extremely worried, and almost half, 45%, said feelings about climate change affected their daily lives. And in the comments from young people, a particularly prominent feeling was that adults and politicians had betrayed them. 80% of young people surveyed in the UK agreed that people had failed to care for the planet, and only 28% of young people surveyed in the UK thought that governments could be trusted. And the lead author of the survey, Caroline Hickman, said, "This shows eco-anxiety is not just for environmental destruction alone, but inextricably linked on climate change. Young feel abandoned and betrayed by governments. We're not just measuring how they feel, but what they think. 4 out of 10 are hesitant to have children. Governments need to listen to the science and not pathologize young people who feel anxious." And the sad reality is that young people in the UK church don't feel much better about the behaviour of the adults responsible for them. In 2020, Tearfund and Youthscape carried out a survey of 630 Christian young people aged between 14 and 19. And of those surveyed, 9 out of 10 were concerned about the climate crisis. 8 out of 10 thought that Christians had a responsibility to respond to climate change. Only a third were confident that their church sees climate change as something they should be concerned about, and only 1 in 10 thought that their church was doing enough about it. Only half of those surveyed said that their church leaders had spoken to them about climate change or prayed about climate change in a meeting, and 2/3 had not heard a sermon on climate change on a Sunday. So in light of these pretty damning statistics, my first question for you is, how will our young people know the church loves them? And let's reflect together on this quotation from a young person who participated in the Tearfund survey that I just mentioned. "Activism really does take it out of you. It would be good if the church didn't add to that. Rather, it would be amazing if it could be a place that does the opposite." So how will our young people know the church loves them? And I don't just mean young people inside the church. What evidence do young people outside your church have that you love them, that you're invested in their future, that you believe that God has plans for their flourishing and not for their harm? And this question does, of course, apply beyond climate change and environmental crises, but let's reflect specifically on that context for a moment. How would a young person in your community know that you were on their side, that you wanted to give them hope, that you were willing to sacrifice your own comfort and security to serve them? In other words, how do they see the image of Christ in you in a destabilizing world? The respondents to the Tearfund survey did in fact give some suggestions of what the church could do as a demonstration of their support. Here's the list, and I'm going to pause for a few moments to let you read some of the ideas written here and to reflect on whether these are things your church community already does or could be prompted to do. Acknowledge the issue. Don't dismiss our involvement as trying to be cool, fashionable, or worldly. Use your gifts to act justly. Don't see justice as a cause for only some types of Christians. Listen to us. Support us emotionally. Pray for us. Take a risk and publicly support actions like the school strikes. Encourage our activism in the church, but don't expect us to do all the work ourselves. Divest from fossil fuels. Teach about this on Sundays and other church settings. Create a culture where responding to climate change is central to what the church does. So one observation I think is worth making about this list is that a great deal of these opportunities to show young people you love them aren't about directly supporting any particular young person, but by taking action ourselves. And this is what brings us to my second question for you. How can the church be a holy people in the world? Because it turns out that loving those we serve and trying to live holy lives are going to look like the same thing. Here's another quotation from the report. When something's not a popular issue anymore, who's going to still be talking about it? That's where the church comes in. They're the people who are going to be against the grain of what the world's doing anyway. I have to make sure that my fuel is from something that's going to actually last, rather than just whatever is popular now. As a church, we are meant to believe that a holy life, lived to the glory of God, is the best life on offer. We teach our young people to pursue holiness, and that's our intention, that they will grow closer to God in doing so. But what message do we send to our young people if we are unwilling as a church to face the hard tasks of holiness ourselves, if we are unwilling to reject the greed which tells us we never have enough, the envy that leads us to covet the lifestyles of others, the sloth that means we are too lazy to fight for what is just? If scripture tells us to be no longer conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our minds, have we allowed our minds to be renewed by the realities of climate injustice and our violence against God's creation? Or do we still mimic the consumer and comfort-driven patterns of this world, and so signal to our young people that holiness is not a call on the whole of our lives? When we love our young people, we will also find ourselves being made more holy, more like the image of Christ. And so finally, my third question, which also flows from the first two. How can we offer our young people hope? In my work in climate activism, I'm often asked what makes me feel hopeful. But limiting our understanding of hope to a passing feeling or sentiment is not really what Christian hope is supposed to look like. One of the respondents to the Tear Fund report summed up this tension really well. The activism can still get me down, and ultimately it's my faith that keeps me going and keeps me more hopeful. And here we see that distinction between passing feelings and circumstances and a life rooted in faithful hope. If you, those you live with, or those young people you minister to follow climate news, most of the time you or they won't feel hopeful. Feeling hopeful has very little to do with being hopeful. We identify ourselves as hopeful people by the choices that we make. Hope, much like love, is a choice. It's a virtue. And for Christians, it's the decision to live as though the kingdom of God is coming in, whether that feels likely or not. If we're constantly looking for things that will make us feel hopeful, we're going to hurt each other. But if hope is a choice expressed in loving and holy action in the world, we can invite people in to make that choice too. Hopeful living, of course, does not replace our grief or our anger or the grief of the young people we support. On the contrary, hopeful living requires grief and anger. Why? Because grief and anger express something similar to hope, knowledge that things can and should be different. Anger and grief are accurate responses to the climate crisis. They are part of truthfulness, but they are also a tool for change. They remind us that greed, destruction, and death is a choice. It's the product of sin, and it doesn't have to be this way. In a climate anxious world, teach yourself and those young people you care for to grieve, to be angry, and to choose hope. And their best teacher will be a church which models this holy love, both now and in the crises to come. So in a few moments, we're going to break into smaller groups so that you have an opportunity to think practically about your own context and these three questions. How do young people know the church loves them? How can the church be a holy people in the world today? And how can we offer our young people hope? And I'm going to suggest that in your groups, you maybe pick one of these questions that sort of resonates most with you to direct your conversation, though the questions will relate to each other. But before we go into groups and have some discussion together, we're going to listen for a few minutes to the steps that one young person is taking to choose hope. So I'm hopeful that I'm now going to hand over smoothly to Rosalind, who's in the room with you.
Sharing, Helen, is that on? Okay, brilliant. Yeah, no, I really resonated with that, and I think it's so great to see so many people here today who are actively engaged. I work for an environmental charity called Keep Northern Ireland Beautiful, and I write for the Belfast Telegraph as an environmental journalist. And yeah, I think faith is integral to the work that I do in terms of not only planet, but also people, how environmentalism is so tied up with social justice issues, human rights violations, human rights abuse. And it's, yeah, such a shame that when I'm at climate strikes, for example, the only time that I see other Christians or other people from faith communities is when they come up to like talk about climate change denial and stuff. And that's a really, really sad reality. And in a lot of these spaces, there really aren't many Christians showing up. So I guess one of the things that struck me in Hannah's presentation, for example, was when she was talking about how the church can attend these climate strikes. And I think beyond like divestment and stuff, it would be really good to see more action and more activism, because I think sometimes the church can shy away from that because I think it's maybe too political. But I think it's really important that we show up in these spaces and show that we care, because we carry such like a weight and a like reputation as well, I guess. So that would be my sort of ask or invitation. But it's so great to see so many people here today, and I think I'm definitely really hopeful about the way the movement is going, and at least in Northern Ireland there's like a growing sense of energy and dynamism in the climate movement.
Thank you. And I'm really hopeful also that somebody in the room has a handle on organising the space and how you break up into groups. So I'll share my screen again so that you can see the questions as you break into groups, and hopefully that will be useful for deciding what you'd like to talk about. But I guess in your hands, basically, if you give me a nudge when you'd like to come back together, and it would be lovely to hear a little bit maybe from some of the people in the room on the things they discuss, and then also we can have some Q&A time.
Brilliant. We have about another 10 to 15 minutes. So I suggest that if you just turn around your chairs and face and form a little group, we're nearly at the end. So if we could turn around in small groups of about, say, 4 people, and then discuss the questions amongst yourselves for about, choose one of the questions first, and then discuss it for 3, 4, 5 minutes, and then we'll come back after that. Hello, everyone. Oh, there we go. Let's have a bit of feedback. Well, can we see the questions again, Jonathan? And don't worry, don't about saying me. Hannah, can you share the questions again? We'll bring them up. So the first one was, well, actually, I'll go to the last one. I remember that one. How can we share young people hope? There we go. How can we offer young people hope? Anyone like to volunteer an answer to that one? Give them a voice, someone said here. Anything else? Listen to them. Give them a voice, but don't let them be the only people speaking. Any other feedback? Hannah, if you want to comment on this, please chip in. Yes. To speak. Enable the voices to speak for themselves. So, yeah. Yep. Yes. Over here? Was there someone over here? Yeah. You're right. It's everyone. Oh, ringing the bell. Oh gosh, our time is. Sorry, one more point. Far away. Giving the young people their voice. What, do you think young people need their space and their voice and people to listen and to truly understand? Say again. Speak up. Yes. Spread the message that the young people say. Okay. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Right, we do have to swap over. Hannah, stay on the line because we're going to do this all over again. Thank you for gathering back so quickly. We're nearly done. What we're going to do is have some feedback, first of all, from you. If you could open your phone again and go to the Slido. And there's a poll here. We've talked about climate change and the biodiversity crisis and so on. And let's test your knowledge, right? So the first question, how much do emissions need to reduce by 2030 for us to be on track for 1.5 degree centigrade temperature rise and no more? What do you think? If you haven't voted, use your phone. You can go to slido.com, type in the code creation care, or use the QR code there. It's a bit of a race here between 50% and 82%, isn't it? 34 people. You see the number at the top, 36. Everyone voted? Some people getting there? Anyone not voted who wanted to vote? Okay, the answer is 50%. The IPCC said this week on Tuesday that we need to reduce emissions in half by 2030 if we're to be on track. So for many of you, the knowledge, you're good. You're good. You understand this stuff. That's another one.
Stephen, the IPCC don't take account of the emissions from militarization.
Yes, there's lots of, it's complex issues, but in general, it's a 50% cut for us to be on track. All right.
Yeah, well, just increased it, we're going to war with.
Yeah, can move on. That's next question. This is on the biodiversity crisis, okay, the crisis of nature. How many species are threatened with extinction in the coming decades? This is according to the International Government Panel on Biodiversity. How many species are threatened with extinction? Remember, we cannot reverse extinction. We can control and try and bring down climate, global warming, but we can never bring back an extinct species. You all voted? Again, you are nearly right, but not quite, right? It's not 400,000, it's 1 million species in the coming decades are threatened with extinction, which is quite a serious issue. I'm sure you would agree. We'll do a final one. This is a word cloud one. That's from that's how you feel now after today. You're feeling excited, right? So what I want to do is to get you to think, add to this, right? Add to these words. First of all, we start off with being busy, hectic, depressed, and now we're all excited, which is brilliant, right? What I want you to think is, in 1 or 2 words, what can your church offer in terms of what's next? What could your church do, right? What could your church do to connect with disengaged young people? What could your church do to hear those whose voices need to be heard and to communicate together? What can your church do to engage locally for local issues in terms of biodiversity or climate justice, as well as internationally? 1 or 2 words. I can see a trend coming through, can't you? Hope. We can offer hope. We can offer love, teaching creation care, planting gardens. I think it brings a new meaning to the word church planting, doesn't it? We could get political. We could be a prophetic voice. We could encourage. We can show leadership. We can participate. Just to point out, and there was some excellent interaction with our exhibitors and so on. And if you could stick around for another few minutes, please go and speak to them. The RSPB actually are here. So if you want to sort of engage with not just the Christian groups, but the groups here, environmental, the Deputy Chair of the Northern Ireland Environment Link is here. And your church can team up with them with some projects and so on. So these are the things that we can do. And thank you for your feedback on this. In a moment, the Archbishop is going to bring us a closing word. But just a reflection from Scripture. In Hebrews 11, it talks about faith leading to hope. And faith leads to hope, but then hope leads to action. And we must act now. 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 Archbishop, would you close, please?
I'm very impressed by the numbers of people who have actually stayed to the end. Often in these conferences, we get to this stage and it's like the Battle of Waterloo. Everybody's lying about all over the place. It's kind of finished. The first thing I want to do is to, on all our behalf, to thank those who have pulled this conference together. And that's, I think, particularly Stephen Trew and Andrew Orr, but also obviously everyone who spoke, everyone who contributed, and to thank Jonathan Hull, who's a technical guy who has made it all work, to thank him very much for making that pretty well seamless for us. I want to just finish nearly where we started with Katharine Hayhoe about something that she said, and being a woman, she put it very positively. In an article I'd written earlier in the week for the Belfast Telegraph, I posed the question, what sort of ancestors are we going to be? She posed it much more positively. How can we show young people that we love them? Which are two sides of a similar kind of coin in a way. And she then went on to use another word, agency. And she used it in place of the word power. It was a word she picked up from the Old Testament. And of course, we can't use the word power anymore because we have abused our power so much. And can you imagine trying to sell something to somebody saying, we can do this by the power of the church? Because that term, that word, the power of the church, has become hateful to people. But nevertheless, we do have an agency because we're so deeply embedded in parishes and in congregations all over this island, and in many ways all over the world, that we are the people who can change the culture. We're the people who can keep repeating the things that need to be repeated and can, and I'm sure they're embarrassed by the number of times they've been referred to, do what these young people have done, that is get their sleeves rolled up and actually be seen to be on the ground doing something, because that will carry far more credibility than all the words that I'm going to say. We have had, and I owe this to a very brief conversation I had with Trevor Sargent passing in the corridor. In one sense, the COVID crisis has given us a leg up because it has increased the public understanding of science and it has increased the public respect for science. And what we're doing is following the science, not following the politicians, but following the science. And that now has a credibility that it once didn't have, or at least was once obscured, and is now very clear and in the open. And we can use that as an evidential base, and that's important. The final thing I want to say, and it's maybe not surprising, I suppose, given the business I'm in, is I want to say something about prayer. Archbishop Eamon Martin told me this story a while ago about the Eucharistic Congress, which was held in Dublin in 1932, which was a great Catholic festival, and people from all over the world came to it. And G.K. Chesterton, who's a great English writer and theologian as well, and really a journalist at heart, was invited by the Catholic Church in Ireland because he'd converted to Catholicism to come and to report on this great Eucharistic Congress. And he came a week or two early just to get the feel for the thing. And he was sitting on the back of a bus in Dublin, and he heard these two Dublin women in front of him talking about the preparations that their parish had made for the Congress. And one of them said, every first Friday for the past 6 months, we have had a novena to pray for good weather for the Congress. And the other one said, every Sunday in the past year, we have been praying for good weather for the Eucharistic Congress. And then there was a bit of a silence, and one of them said to the other, well, if it rains on that day, he has only himself to blame. And with the best will in the world, prayer isn't suggesting to God something which otherwise wouldn't have occurred to him. Prayer is bringing the presence of God into the situation that you find yourself. And as Trevor also remarked, to some extent, we need a miraculous change, because a change in culture is always a miraculous thing. But there comes a point when it happens. It comes, it doesn't look as though it's ever going to happen, and then all of a sudden it happens. By our own efforts and by bringing the presence of God into what it is we're doing, and therefore affecting how we behave and how other people behave, I think we can do that. And although these events may seem small and modest, and we may seem to be preaching to the converted, nevertheless, we share ideas, we give each other enthusiasm to go forward, and we show that the church does care and does love another generation who are going to have to live in the world that we bequeath to them. And the way I had put it in my typically male negative way was, who, when his son asks for bread, will give him a stone, which is what we're in danger of giving people, a dead stone rather than the bread of life. So I'm going to finish there, and I'm simply going to use a very short prayer from the Book of Common Prayer, which is usually used on Mondays, which is the day set up over for creation. So, Almighty God, maker of all good things, Father, Lord of all creation, in Christ you have shown us the purpose of your providence and called us to be responsible in the world. So may we delight in your purpose and work to bring all things to their true end, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Sláinte.